Hi everyone, welcome to THD, and today we are going to talk about rotation. FFG has recently announced how they will be rotating Star Wars Unlimited, and I've seen a lot of people talking about the subject. Some are in favor of it, some are against, and I've seen a lot of people kind of having some misinformation or misunderstanding on what this rotation is for and what it's trying to accomplish, which is natural because it's a pretty complex subject. So I just wanted to provide a bit more information on the reason why we do rotation in the first place and how is it beneficial for the game. So the first thing that we're going to explore is obviously the what is a rotation. So a rotation is basically an idea of some cards going out of the main way to play the game, which is going to be Premiere, uh, every year. And it's so the way it works in Star Wars Limited is like each year is a batch. So every batch has between 1 or 3 expansion, depending on how far along we are in the year. And in Premiere, the last 2 batches are legal. So the first batch is gonna have no name because it's literally the 3 expansion we already have right now. But then moving on, every batch will have its own tag, which is going to be at the bottom of the card. In the first batch after this year, so the second batch is going to be called Batch A. A Premiere format will contain between 4 to 6 expansions in total, depending on how far along in the year of the second batch we are. So that's the full batch plus another batch that is currently being released. And it's also the same system as the old Magic Standard, where they had the 2 last block being legal, each block containing 4 sets, 1 starter set plus 3 sets in the block. So that's basically between 5 to 8 sets, so it's a bit more sets than what we have gonna have for Premiere. But to be fair, in Magic, starter sets are usually not super relevant for competitive play. So we are and usually Star Wars Limited sets are bigger than Magic sets on average. So I would say it is about the same amount of cards in a. So this is a formula that has held the test of time for decades in Magic the Gathering. And on top of this, obviously, there's going to be a new format emerging, which is going to be called Eternal, where basically every card in Eternal will be legal. So you're going to have the Premiere format and the Eternal format going alongside each other. What are the advantages of a rotation? So why are we doing this? So the first reason is that unless we are practicing systematic power creep, as more expansion are released, a smaller and smaller percentage of each of those sets becomes competitively viable. So let's say that you're releasing a set. I mean, we saw actually this in the first year of Star Wars Limited. So at the beginning, there were a pretty big portion of the first set that was competitively viable because that was the only set available. I would say, from my estimation, it would be about like 60 to 70% of the set was actually competitively relevant. Then as the set came out, so the second set, that percentage was even smaller. And then in set 3, this percentage was even smaller. Obviously, set 3 and set 2 being significantly weaker than set 1 did not help that and kind of amplify that phenomenon. But even in a world where those sets were equally as powerful as the previous set before them, we would have seen a smaller and smaller percentage of those of the card in the set becoming completely viable. And the problem with that is that it only gets worse as more and more sets are released. A smaller and smaller percentage of the cards in the set are competitively relevant. And has a big importance because what happens then is that it leads the meta to be very stale. The more sets you have in a format, the harder it is to move the needle. So, for example, if you play old formats in Magic the Gathering, like Modern or Legacy, every set that Wizards of the Coast release has very, very small impact on the meta because there's just so many cards that those new cards have to compete with. It's hard for them to make a space. Well, obviously, and that means the meta evolves very slowly because there's very few new blood being introduced. That is, the more the more sets in the format, the more it is difficult for this format to evolve. Um, and the other argument is that one of the most important argument is that obviously it also produced very bad sales. We already seen this with set 3, where because the set was very weak, there were not many cards that were worth getting for the competitive players. And yes, competitive players do not represent the entirety of the Star Wars Unlimited community, but it represents a very big chunk. And one of the main reasons why set 3 did not sell very well is simply because there were no good cards to be obtained in relationships to what already existed. And so not as there is smaller and smaller percentage of cards become completely viable in a set, sales dwindle. And that's obviously not good for FFG. So there's when people say rotation is just here to kind of squeeze money out of people, it is kind of true, but at the meantime, it's completely necessary because mechanically, uh, as we are getting more and more cards, it's only natural that a lesser percentage of that set becomes relevant, and it is absolutely necessary for a company to be able to sell product. And good luck selling product in an environment where there is no rotation. It inevitably over time it's going to become impossible. Um, Keeping the main game at a certain size is the only way to fight that and make sure every expansion has a significant impact on the meta, regardless of the longevity. But obviously, rotation has other benefits, which I'll talk about briefly here. First of all, it helps provide a new environment for old cards to evolve in. Certain cards that were not playable because other cards existed, when those cards rotates out, it creates space for those new cards to exist and be competitive. And that obviously includes the new card that are getting released, but also some other cards which were not part of the same batch as the other cards. So a good example for this, for example, is Overwhelming Barrage. When Overwhelming Barrage is going to rotate out, it's going to leave space for Turbo Laser Salvo to maybe see play. This is obviously very hypothetical, but there's really no reason, in my opinion, even in an heroism deck, to play Turbo Laser Salvo over Overwhelming Barrage. However, when Overwhelming Barrage rotates out, maybe it's going to create enough space for Turbo Laser Salvo to see play. So that's like an example. Maybe it's not going to work it that way, but you understand the idea, right? Certain cards that basically not going to see any play might become playable because certain cards rotates out and leave space. And that's also true for leaders as well. So that's something very interesting to keep in mind. That there's always an increased dynamic environment that is kind of fun to explore, and some cards that can basically become relevant once the rotates happened, and that's quite cool. Another very important factor as well is that with Eternal, there will be two official ways to play Star Wars Unlimited competitively. And it's going to be very fun to explore those new formats and see. And one of the advantages of having two competitive formats is that if one format is bad because it's not balanced or whatever, the other, you can kind of fall back on the other one and have fun on the other one instead. And that's a very nice flexibility to be able to have. So as far as the magic, as far as what you can expect as a competitive player between the main difference between the two, Premiere will probably be more fair. More standard decks are going to be in Premiere most likely. Decks like aggro, mid-range, control, similar to what we have now in Star Wars Unlimited. And the meta is going to evolve very, very much every time a new set gets released because the card pool is smaller. So expect a more dynamic meta that involves a lot with each expansion and expect more fair decks. However, the Eternal format will be the opposite of this. It will be more unfair, where more powerful decks, more extreme decks, which is extremely aggro deck or extremely control decks, fewer mid-range decks, and more combo decks and hard combo decks. It's the same phenomenon that happens whenever you look at Magic the Gathering, when you look at Modern and Legacy. Those formats systematically have a different vibe to them because they have different kinds of deck that involves whenever you get so many cards. You're going to get more kind of extreme strategies. So it is something that you can like or dislike. It's up to kind of your opinion. And the meta will obviously involve a lot slower as well, because every set will have a smaller impact on the new set. Also, interestingly, eternal formats usually have more diverse meta, which means that because they have more cards, more leaders, more possibilities, there's more deck to be played, and that creates a more diverse metagame. Obviously, that's assuming there's a proper ban list and a proper management from FFG to the ban list to make sure that certain decks and strategy don't remain out of control. But assuming that's the case, modern and legacy almost always have a wider amount of different competitive decks that can be played in their formats, as opposed to standard, because they simply just have more stuff to do, to work with. So this is something. So both have their advantages and inconvenience. It's up to you to decide which one you prefer, and maybe you like both and you want to play both, which hopefully that's the case. So now let's talk about the disadvantages of rotation, and because obviously there's many people who don't like rotation and they speak against it, and obviously there are good reasons why they don't like it. The first one is like it sucks to see your favorite card or leader rotates out and be introduced in a format where they might not be as competitive. That's not going to happen on the first rotation, because obviously on the first rotation, at least at the beginning, there will be very small differences between the Eternal and the Premier, because when the first rotation happens, there will be there's only going to be one set different between the old Premier and the new Eternal. There will be only one set difference. So at the beginning, the rotation is not going to hurt your favorite card or leader, assuming you want to transition from Premier to Eternal. However, as time goes on and as more sets will be introduced, your favorite leaders, when they rotate out, they might be introduced into a stronger format where they might not be able to see play anymore because they're not as competitive. So that's kind of the disadvantage. This is what we're seeing happening in Magic. It is a legit concern, but I think this is not really that much different from simply the game evolving. Like, this is already happening naturally. For example, when we saw Han, the young Han was one of the best leader in set 2, and in set 3 not really much anymore, because we've evolved into a meta where Tarkington is everywhere and makes it much more difficult to play Han. So you saw that happening. Obviously it's kind of something that happened naturally, but basically your favorite card and leaders is threatened to be kind of rendered not as competitive anymore at any time a new expansion comes out. So it's not that really different from that. So the only difference here is that they're kind of forced to rotate out. But then they are all going to be introduced. They're still going to be able to play them technically, but that's going to be an Eternal, and then question or not whether those will be playable in that format or not. The second biggest argument, and to me that's the most legit argument against rotation, and this is that it's going to split the community. Obviously there's going to be people who are going to prefer to play Premier, and there's going to be people who prefer to play Eternal. So that's going to split the competitive in two, and that's obviously not great. If your community is small, splitting the community is very bad. So it is definitely the biggest concern concerning having multiple formats. And I think that in the short run, I think people will be playing both. That's kind of what I think, because there's, once again, they're not going to be that big of a difference between Eternal and Premier, at least on the short run. So if you have a deck in Eternal, most likely you have a deck in Premier and vice versa. So I'm not too concerned, at least in the short term. In the long run, as basically Eternal and Premier becomes more and more different from one another as time goes by, then this is where I can see the split of the community becoming a little bit more of a problem. Hopefully by that time, the game has grown to such a size that it's no longer an issue. But then if it ever is an issue, I think it would most likely being an issue of the game not being as popular enough, rather than the rotation system. Because as I said in my previous slides, rotation is very much needed for other reasons. Another concern that I can have is obviously the fact that if your card rotates out, it will drop in value. And it's most likely going to be the case, but this can be strongly mitigated, if not completely overcome, simply by having a very active Eternal scene. So if FFG properly supports Eternal as a competitive format with tournaments and stuff like that, uh, most likely your staple that will not drop in value as much when they transition from Premier to Eternal, because they will still find a way to be played. Obviously, some cards that were very strong. So basically, Eternal as a format really helps keeping the value of the card relevant over time. The only question is, will FFG properly support Eternal, or with it just, for me there's a big difference if FFG decides to use Premier is the only way to play the game, and Eternal is just like, here it does exist on paper but there's no support for it, there's no tournament being played on it. Then I guess the committee will have to take initiative on that particular front. I really truly hope that FFG will support Eternal, because otherwise it kind of defeats the purpose of having an Eternal format, which is supposed to be a format where that allows cards to keep their value because there's a way they can be played even when they get rotated out. Sorry. One of the alternative to rotation. Well, first of all, we already established that a non-rotative game is not sustainable in the long term, because smaller and smaller percentage of the cards becomes relevant. It hurts sales and it hurts the meta because it makes it very stale. So there are other way to rotate. We could. Some people have suggested that only rotates the leader. Create a retirement system. I'm not getting to the details of what are the pros and the cons of each of the rotation system, because I haven't experienced anything those systems personally. So I could kind of theorize around it, but I prefer to leave this to people who know better. But there are other ways to rotate. They just decided to pick the system that has been the most familiar probably to most card game players, and also a system that has proven to work for decades. There's also rotation by power creep, which is what Yu-Gi-Oh does, where there's no proper real rotation. It's just that every set that they print is so much stronger than the previous one that naturally people just pick up the new cards, and the meta just evolves like that. I personally don't like the system, as it's a very forced way to. It kind of is a way that makes it so old card become completely irrelevant, as opposed to Eternal, where at least in the with the rotation, where at least in Eternal you can play the old cards. Here you'd only have one format, so there's only one way to play the game, and if your card sucks because it's been power creeped out of the game, then there's no way to play it as a competitive play, which obviously sucks. So I don't like this system. I'm pretty sure a lot of people would agree with me on that. What's my personal opinion on the way FFG has decided to do rotation? My first opinion is that FFG has decided to choose this system, which has proven to work for decades. It is the most well-known system, and I think I agree with this approach. Basically, if you realize something about Star Wars Unlimited, is that every step of the way, FFG has decided to take the safe approach, as opposed to their previous games like Star Wars Destiny, Legion of the Five Rings, or Keyforge, where they were really trying to innovate and bring something new to the market. This time they've decided, no, we're going to try to play it safe. We're going to do everything that has worked well, and we're going to combine this in one perfect package. And that's exactly what they did with Star Wars Limited, and I think it's a better approach. At least for this game, it was a better approach. And this is what makes Star Wars Limited is successful, in my opinion, is that it's just combines everything that is great about other games and combine it in one single package. And they are adopting the same approach to rotation. They pick a system that they think is the most robust, that has proven to work on the long run, and they're going for it because they care about the longevity of the game. They don't care much about experimenting. They're not trying to experiment, because experimenting is always a gamble. They could have went for a different rotation system. They could have, but it would have been a gamble. They've decided to play it safe, and I agree with this. I personally, so people be asking me if I'll be playing Eternal or Premier. And the answer is obviously I'll be playing both. For me, it's going to be twice more opportunities to create content over the game, so you can expect me to make content about both Eternal and Premiere. If obviously my channel survives long enough until then, because we're still talking about something that's going to happen in 1 year. Usually, I do prefer playing Eternal formats because I like the diversity of different decks and different approach to the game that it provides. And I love having, but I will be playing both. I love having multiple formats to explore and experiment with. But yeah, generally speaking, I'm more of an Eternal. I'm more of an Eternal player. If you think about Magic, I play Modern and Legacy. I like combo decks. I like those kind of out of the box strategies that really change the way you play the game drastically. I love this diversity. But I also like the dynamic approach of Premiere, the fact that every set is going to have a big impact. I also like that too. So there's things to like in both, and I hope that both formats thrives. And I'll be playing both. I think FFG is 100% correct in announcing rotation far in advance, so that helps people kind of like prepare for this. And it's gonna kind of like cast away any sort of controversy. They decided to announce it right now. I think it's a good call to announce this far in advance so people can get ready. Obviously, this is going to have an impact on the market as well. So the people are not going to be taken off guard by this. So it's a very correct move to announce it far in advance. And the last thing I want to say is that I really hope that FFG supports Eternal with a good amount of competitive tournaments and major tournaments to be played in this format. I don't expect the Galactic Championship to be played in Eternal because Premiere is going to remain the primary way to play the game competitively. But I hope that at least we're going to get some sector qualifiers, some regional qualifiers, and some planetary qualifiers in Eternal. And I also hope that other big tournament organizer like OPE will support Eternal tournaments. So that's something that I really hope will happen, and I think it's necessary if they want to make sure that the cards hold their value and Eternal is going to be a real format to compete in. Yeah, so that's basically it for my opinion on this particular subject as well as my analysis. If there's anything I've missed, other like advantages and disadvantages about rotation, please let me know. I'll be interested to know what you think about it. And I also would like to, if you like the video, to please like and subscribe, and also share that video if you find someone that is kind of like does not understand why we're doing rotation and stuff. You can share that video and I will give them like more explanation on the reason we're doing all that. And without further ado, thank you very much and I'll see you next time.